Muy buenas tardes, mis
Good
queridos
evening, my
amigos.
dear friends. Just a little over a year ago, I presented myself here for the very first time to welcome you to the Faith and Science Fundamentals webinar series. I was very nervous because it was the first time that I was going to do something like this, a weekly webinar series that would run for 4 months and that would also be simultaneously translated into 8 different languages. If I tell you the truth, I had no idea about the amount of work that this would take. But thankfully, with God's help, we moved forward. The weeks started going by, the technical problems were solved slowly, and many of you sent us messages saying that you were enjoying the series and learning a lot, and that you even sent the videos to friends that were interested in the topics. I was also very happy to find out that our audience was made up of viewers from many different countries and of many different ages. Many of you said, "My father, who is in Romania, is really enjoying the series." And I know that there were even some teenagers who followed us, and they happen to be the most fussy audience. And overall, all of this work over the 4 months was worth it. But it was also very demanding, and the whole team was looking forward to it being over so that we could rest. But what no one knew was that once we had the final session all ready to go, that something awful would happen and that we wouldn't be able to finish the series. I think that all of you already know, 3 days before the final session, on the 9th of May, I had a very serious climbing accident. A fall from the height of 8 meters, and it left me hospitalized for 45 days. I spent 2 weeks in the intensive care unit, had 2 very complicated reconstructive surgeries, and then spent 4 months in a wheelchair. It was probably the most difficult experience that my family and I had ever gone through. But it was also a beautiful experience because we had a lot of support from many, many people through this whole time. I didn't know that so many people cared for me, and it was precious to find that out. I know that many of you prayed for me for many months, and I thank you with all of my heart. God heard your prayers, and He not only saved my life, He also allowed me to walk again and become strong enough to be able to start working again. And so here I am, very happy and very thankful to be able to share this session, number 16 of the Faith and Science Fundamentals webinar series, Human Fossils. Just like dinosaurs, the topic of human fossils raises passionate debates about origins. There is a diversity of opinions on these fossils, both in the creationist and evolutionary fields, which are defended with fervor, and perhaps with too much fervor sometimes. But if we think about it, it's logical. Things that matter to us generate emotional reactions. At its core, the controversy over dinosaur fossils is about the image that we have of God, about whether we could imagine God creating these seemingly violent and ferocious monsters, and about the authenticity of the biblical account of the flood. How much more will what fossils tell us affect us? And so human fossils could hold the secrets of our origins and what it means to be human. And that matters to us. But as we've been doing since the beginning of this series, we need to try, even when regarding this very emotional subject, to keep an open mind and the most objective attitude possible. Let's start by clarifying some terms. We've called this session Human Fossils, but this is not totally correct because some of the fossils that we're going to look at may not have been human. The title that I had given this session last year was Hominid Fossils, but this term is not very precise. If you've read something on this subject, even in popular science articles, you've probably seen that most of them speak of hominin or homins and not hominids. Let me explain why there's a difference. A few years ago, the word hominids was used to describe modern humans and their fossil ancestors. But it turns out that when studying the DNA of great apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, scientists realized that it was very similar to human DNA. So they decided to include them in the group of hominids and to coin another word, hominins, for today's humans and their fossil ancestors. We can say that hominins are a subset of hominids. Hominids are a larger group that include modern humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, and all of their fossils. While hominins would leave out the great apes of today. And all of this is framed within the evolutionary framework that assumes that great apes and humans have an older common ancestor. But because I don't have this cosmovision or worldview, I have decided to use a more general term in the title, human fossils, referring to fossils that are clearly human and those that are similar to humans, which in some cases could be fossils of great apes, because humans and chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans are physically similar, and therefore their skeletons are too. Okay. Can someone tell me in the chat what the most important thing that we learned last year is? It's something that I repeated over and over again in almost every session, starting with the very first one. What is the most important thing that we learned last year? Let's see if somebody knows. Very good. Very, very good. Exactly. The difference between data and interpretation. So I'm going to put some photos up on the screen, and I would like you to tell me over the chat if it has to do with data or interpretation. There you have it. What do you say? Is this data or interpretation? Well, we have multiple answers here. Responses, that's people saying that they are data. Like other times, this is a trick question that could actually be answered both ways. These are photos of real fossil skulls, and therefore they could be considered data. But if you look closely, some are made up of small fragments, which means that they have been reconstructed, and therefore we would find ourselves at a first level of interpretation. As we said last year about the dinosaurs, most of the fossils are fragmented. So this would be more like the pure data. And to go from this to a complete skull, paleontologists have to assemble the puzzle. In the past, this was done by hand. But today, there are computer programs that do the work for us, which are even capable of filling in the gaps. And this is then followed by a second level of interpretation in which the muscles are added to the skull and later the facial features. To be able to do this, computer programs similar to the ones that forensics use to reconstruct human skeletons are also used. And we have to say that these levels of interpretation are considered quite reliable. But from this point on, it hedges more towards speculation. So if you follow the process, it's pretty clear, but then it starts moving into speculation. For example, When we add the color of the skin or the amount of facial and body hair, there's nothing in the bones that indicates that information. And the same thing happens with the reconstruction of the way of life of these individuals. Sometimes there are archaeological remains, such as weapons, tools, jewelry, or works of art, that give us clues of how they lived or behaved. But it's very easy at this higher level of interpretation to have a lot of bias from the researcher's cosmovision or worldview. And this is why in many films and documentaries, primitive human beings are depicted as clumsy, a bit dumb, or unable to communicate. But a researcher starting from a biblical worldview would never interpret ancient human beings in this way. We believe that God created human beings to be intelligent and to have capabilities superior to ours. So sometimes we go to the other extreme and speculate about what the antediluvians could have done, also without having data to support our ideas. Another type of interpretation that is also highly affected by the researcher's cosmovision or worldview occurs when we compare different fossils with each other and order them according to an established pattern. For example, I'm sure you've seen this representation of the different types of hominids arranged in a linear fashion from something very similar to a chimpanzee to a modern-day human being. Well, this comes from a 1965 drawing by the painter Rudolf Zallinger titled Ape Parade. And at the caption at the bottom of the drawing, the author explained that the drawing was based on fragmentary fossil evidence and that although prototypes and apes were quadrupedal, all are shown here standing for the purpose of comparison. So basically, the author was admitting that his representation of human evolution was an invention. But the drawing became super famous and has since been one of the most successful tools in promoting evolution. Today, paleontologists do not believe in a linear evolution from the chimpanzee to the human being, but in something similar to a tree, in which the chimpanzee and the modern human are at the end of the branches, and the hominid fossils are in the middle. But this is another interpretation based on a previous acceptance of the theory of evolution. The different fossils are data, but many of the connections between them that indicate kinship are not supported by the data, especially at the base levels of the tree, which in this case are at the top of the drawing. And with that said, we're going to talk about some of the most famous human fossils, or hominid fossils. And most of the information that I'm going to share with you today, I've taken from two sources. The first is this book called Contested Bones, and whose authors are Dr. John Sanford, who we already talked about as the discoverer of genetic entropy, and Christopher Roop, who was a student at the Department of Biology and Earth Sciences at Loma Linda. This book is very interesting because although neither of the two authors is a paleoanthropologist, it isn't necessary because they're not talking about their own discoveries. What the book does is review all the relevant literature on hominin fossils from the last decades and describe the variety of interpretations that exist within the mainstream scientific community. To me, this book reminds me of The Never-Ending Story because it's written in two colors. To highlight what are verbatim quotes from specialists, the authors use the color blue. So when you read it, you realize that not everything is as clear or as beautiful as it seems in documentaries. But that is in a field which there are a lot of controversy, personal interests, and many changes in interpretation as new data appears affect this. So if you read in English, I recommend this book to you. Another source of very useful information is this topic on the videos of Professor Todd Wood, an Adventist biologist who specializes in baraminology. In case you don't remember, baraminology is a classification of living beings from the biblical point of view, trying to determine the groups that were created of those that were preserved in the ark. So Todd Wood has several videos on hominin fossils and his studies of them that are very good and easy to understand. They're very good and very easy to understand. So as always, I have included the reference of this book and the links to the videos and the list of additional resources and materials. So the first chapter of Contested Bones is an introduction to the fascinating world of paleanthropology. The authors tell us that there are two trends among specialists. There are the splitters, or separators, and the lumpers, or groupers. That means that there are some researchers who tend to classify fossils into many different groups, while others tend to make fewer groups. For the separators, as soon as there is a small difference, the fossil then deserves to be classified as a different species, while the groupers believe that many fossils are simply varieties of the same species and only consider fossils that present important differences to be different species. There are more separators than groupers, because being a separator has an advantage for the researcher. In biology, when you discover a new species, you have the right to name it. And if it's a species of a human ancestor, you also become famous. But if you discover only one variety of something that was already known, well, then nobody pays attention to you. Here's a list of different hominin skull fossils that have been described and classified. According to the separators, there are more than 20 species distributed in 6 genera. But according to the groupers, there are basically 2 types of fossils. Those belonging to the genus Homo and Australopithecines, which are classified in the genus Australopithecus, or similar. In this photo, you can see an example of each. On the left, it's the skull of a Homo, specifically Homo sapien, a modern human. It has a large rounded cranial cavity that can hold a large brain. It has a flat face. The eyebrows are lightly marked, and although you can't see it in the photo, the hole that connects the skull with the spinal column is in the middle of the base of the skull, making the head rest vertically on the spine. This indicates that the Homo walked upright. Australopithecus have much smaller cranial cavity and very large ridges in the brow area, a jaw that protrudes forward, and the hole that connects to the spine is in the back of the head. And this is typical of a diagonal union with the spine and occurs in animals that walk on all fours. Basically, the creationist stance regarding hominid fossils is that they can be divided into 2 independent groups that are not connected by kinship. On the one hand, there are the fossils of the human family, descendants of Adam and Noah. And on the other hand, the fossils of the Australopithecines, that would be animals similar to chimpanzees, as we've seen with the dinosaurs and other groups. It's possible that in ancient times, biological diversity was greater within each created group, and that later some types have become extinct, leaving only one or a few surviving types. In the case of Homo, we would be the only ones that are left, and the Homo sapiens. And in the case of the apes, we would have the chimpanzees, the gorillas, and the orangutans. And as it almost always happens, we won't have enough time to talk in detail about all of the fossils from both groups, so I'm going to focus on two of them that are very well known, and then I will give you some brief ideas on a few more. If you want to know more, in Sanford and Roop's book, there is a whole chapter dedicated to each of the most important types of fossils. We're going to start with a fossil that is so famous that it has its own name. I'm sure that you've all heard of Lucy. Lucy is a partial skeleton of a female Australopithecus afarensis that was discovered in Ethiopia in 1974. Many museums have reconstructions of Lucy in their exhibits, and here are a couple of them. These two were found in two different museums. We've said before that for creationists, Australopithecus would be a group of animals similar to chimpanzees. But in these photos, Lucy appears to be more human than the chimpanzee that I have put on the right. I'm going to ask you a question that you can answer in the chat. What is it about Lucy that makes her look more human than the picture on the right, which is a chimpanzee? What do you think? Why does she look more human than the chimpanzee? We have some answers already. Very good. Perfect. There's pretty much everybody with that agree with the same thing. There are basically two things: the eyes and the distribution of facial hair. When we look at a person in the eye, we see a white area around the iris. However, in chimpanzees, the visible part of the eye is all dark. And Lucy has human eyes. But do you remember what we said earlier? Lucy is a skeleton, and skeletons don't have eyes or hair. Let's look at the rest of the body. We've seen her face, now we're going to look at the rest. On the left, we have the complete reconstruction of Lucy in a museum, and on the right, her fossil skeleton. As you can see, the complete skeleton was not found, but approximately 40% was, which were the bones that you see in brown. What makes the Lucy on the left look human? Aside from the upright posture, the most human thing she has are her hands and feet. But if you look at the skeleton on the right, it turns out that no bones were found. Not from the feet or the hands. All of this reinforces what we have said at the beginning, which is that many times the interpretations of the fossils show the bias of the researcher. Those who made these reconstructions wanted Lucy to be a link between apes and people, and that's why they gave her human eyes, hands, and feet, even though that information is not in the data. In reality, if we take Lucy's bone information just as it is, it's much more chimpanzee-like than the reconstruction shows. Now let's move on to the representative of the Homo genus, which is also very famous. I'm sure that you've all heard of Neanderthals. The first Neanderthal fossil was discovered in 1829, and other similar fossils were discovered throughout the rest of the 19th century, like this one. This one was found in Gibraltar. But the most famous one that's known as the Old Man of La Chapelle is this one here, like an old man. He was found in France in 1908, and he was very well preserved. Since then, many other remains have been found, more than 400. So we have a lot of information about the Neanderthals and what they were like, or at least their bones. The skeleton of the body is very similar to that of Homo sapiens, although the bones are more robust. The head is slightly larger and has a few different features, such as the forehead that slopes back and very large ridges on the eyebrow bone. This is the first artistic reconstruction of a Neanderthal, which was made in the 19th century. Here you can see it a little bit bigger. And later, others appeared, in which they were also depicted with ape-like features and dark skin. Although most of the fossils have been found in Europe. Well, in recent decades, the genetic advances and the discovery of organic material in many fossils has made it possible to sequence the DNA of Neanderthals. And scientists have discovered that Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis interbred and had children, and that most Europeans have Neanderthal DNA in our genome. The study of the Neanderthal DNA has also provided more information about their physical appearance, confirming that they had light skin and reddish hair. So the reconstructions of Neanderthals that appear today in museums and textbooks are completely different from the first ones. Now they are represented like this. A few years ago, I read an article in the popular science magazine Muy Interesante that I found it was actually very interesting, and it was titled The Neanderthal Revolution. And it talks about everything that I just told you about. It says, for example, you could run into a Neanderthal in the bus line and you wouldn't even notice. In today's world, he would be just another citizen. The article also talks about some of the other human fossils that have been found in recent years and concludes that with the following statement. There was never a clash between human species. The latest studies show that our extinct evolutionary relatives interbred with each other and with our ancestors, and that many current populations retain their genetic imprint. Therefore, more and more experts think that in all this time, there has been only one humanity. This, however, was more diverse in the past. This is not a creationist magazine. It's a popular science magazine that you can buy at the newsstand, and that states the same thing that Sanford and Roop said in their book, that all Homo fossils were actually part of a single humanity, a single species. Reproductive compatibility is the characteristic that is most used to define biological species. If two organisms can reproduce with each other, it's because they are of the same species. Genetic studies have shown us that different Homo could and did reproduce with each other, so we shouldn't really call them Homo neanderthalensis or Homo erectus, etc. They would all be and should be Homo sapiens, just like us. Only, as the article says, the diversity of the species was greater in the past, and there were greater differences than today in the physical appearances between some humans and others. For example, in size. There were differences in size. There's a type of fossil that is also included in the Homo genus, which is affectionately known as hobbits, because they were so small. The adults were no more than a meter tall. These fossils were found on the island Isla de Flores, and their scientific name is Homo floresiensis. Paleontologists thought that with such a small head and brain, they couldn't have human intelligence, and in the first reconstructions, that they looked something similar to this. But it turns out that one of the skulls was so well preserved that it had the marks of the brain on the inside. And while studying it, the scientists have concluded that the brain was completely human, and that they've even been able to distinguish the mark from the area that is responsible for speech. So they are currently considered fully human. The fact that they are small in size may be the result of a biological phenomenon known as island dwarfism. Many species of mammals that live on the islands are smaller than their continental versions. They suppose that it's an adaptation to the scarcity of resources. An animal or a smaller person needs less to eat. So, in short, most hominin fossils are either clearly human or clearly chimpanzee-like. But as always, there are some exceptions. There are some fossils, most of them recently discovered, that present a mosaic of characteristics, making them difficult to classify. For example, in 2013, hundreds of hominid bones of an unknown species called Homo naledi were discovered inside a cave in South Africa. These fossils have a very human appearance, which is why they belong in the Homo genus. But they have some characteristics that are similar to Australopithecus. The head is small, but now we see that that's not a problem. Although we've already said, but the eyebrow bone is prominent, like the Neanderthals. But in addition to this, the jaw projects forward a little, and the most curious thing is the structure of the arms and hands. They have an opposable thumb, which is a typical human characteristic that gives us precision and manual dexterity in comparison to chimpanzees or gorillas. But the rest of the fingers have elongated and curved bones, much longer and more curved than we have. And at the shoulder joint, the humerus doesn't protrude from the side. Instead of protruding from the side, it's rather inclined upwards. And this, together with the curved fingers, is typical of organisms that usually have their arms raised, for example, for climbing or hanging from tree branches. What's more, the place where the bones have been found is a very deep and inaccessible chamber of a cave, which is why it is believed that they didn't just end up there by chance, but rather that it's kind of a collective tomb. So if the Homo naledi buried their dead, that indicates that they were more human. National Geographic calls this species almost human and depicts them with this aspect. Creationists still don't have a clear idea of naledi. There are those who think that it is a poorly classified Australopithecus, and others who think that it was a type of human that, due to its way of life or its daily activities, had some special adaptations in the bones. They had their arms and fingers adapted to their way of life. And lastly, other fossils that are also a mystery to paleoanthropologists are the Dmanisi. They were discovered in the site of Georgia between 1991 and 2005. And the curious thing about these skulls is that they are very different from each other. Some are typically Neanderthal, but there is one, skull number 5, which has a small cranial cavity and a jaw that protrudes forward. All of these skulls have been classified in the Homo genus. But the debate among scientists is whether they belong to one or more species. If they had been found in different places, without a doubt, they would have been classified as different species because they are very different from each other. But since they were all found together in the same geographical place and in the same layers, The logical thing is to think that they were part of the same population and therefore they were the same species. And if that's the case, it means that ancient humans presented a great variety of physical differences, giving reason to the groupers. And as always, we don't know everything, far from it, and we have to continue investigating this interesting topic. And I'm sure that more fossils will appear in the future that will clarify some of our doubts and provoke others. And just that, in the last few weeks, I've collected various scientific articles about hominin fossils that say that they will change the classification or what is believed of human ancestors. I'm going to show you just a couple of the examples. The most ancient Homo sapien lived 35,000 years before what was originally believed. A mysterious fossil skull expands the human family tree, but there are unresolved questions. But all of this is part of the beauty of science. And we have to pay attention, because in some fields, such as this one, things change constantly. I would like to end by commenting on something important. We're used to documentaries and textbooks placing all these species of ancient humans in prehistoric times, a long period of time that stretches hundreds of thousands of years into the past, depending on the perspective. But what is their creationist interpretation? When did all of these groups live? Well, because of the layers where they are found, the highest part of the geologic column, the creationist interpretation is that they are all post-flood. I repeat, we have not found any remains prior to the flood. Some people wonder, if ancient humans were as intelligent as we are today, why did they live so primitively? But if we think about it in just a little bit more, it kind of makes sense. The flood completely destroyed human civilization with all of its advances. They are unknown to us, but they most likely did exist, and the 8 survivors of the ark had to start from scratch. If today there were a universal catastrophe that destroyed all technology and only my family and I survived, well, I'm sure something similar would happen to us. I know that there are cars, refrigerators, and particle accelerators, but I am completely incapable of making one. I don't even know if I would be able to make my own clothes. And I don't know how to build a house, so I would probably end up living in a cave. After the flood, the descendants of Noah spread throughout the world and had to rebuild civilization. In each place, they did it differently and at different paces. And since God had created human beings with the ability to adapt to different conditions, they also diversified physically, and that is why we find so many types of Homo fossils. Later, some of these groups became extinct due to disease, war, or other reasons, and now those of us who remain are all very similar to each other, at least as far as the skeleton is concerned. And this is an interpretation. We'll end today's topic here, and we're also concluding our series of Faith and Science Fundamentals. Thank you so much for joining us during these 16 weeks. Many thanks to our translators who have made it possible for us to offer these topics in 8 languages. And we also have to thank God, especially God, for being a creator, such a marvelous creator, and for doing everything so well. And if you want to stay informed about any new and similar activities in the future, let's see if we can have some more information here. These are our social networks, GRI Live Creation. You can also send me an email to the one that you see here on the screen, noemi.duran@eud.adventist.org. And you can request that we include you in our database to send you information directly. And it has been a great pleasure to share this time with you, all of you. And of course, here we have the Geoscience Research Institute webpage that you can check in. As I said, it's been a great pleasure sharing this time with you, and may God bless all of you.